So good morning, everybody. We have just opened the webinar and we'll just give people a few seconds to join. I'm just passing through 100 participants in climbing. We've got nearly 500 registered for today. So just give everyone a few seconds to get online, and then we'll kick off. Very good. Well, look, my name's Henry Elphick. I'm the CEO of Lang Buisson. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you today to this webinar on rights and regulation post-COVID-19 in partnership with Bevan Britain and also with Care Markets, our journal focused on social care, the Care Workers Charity, and Turn to Us, two charities that have been raising significant amounts of money. And been doing a lot. So they've been charities of the moment over the last few months. The Care Workers Charity in particular has raised £1.7 million so far and has been distributing that to care workers who are in straitened financial circumstances. Rights and regulation is very much the topic of the day because we're starting to see some interesting developments in terms of what is happening as people discuss the post-COVID outlook. And I think from setting the scene perspective, we talk about regulation, but the reality is there are so many regulators out there, and the Care Quality Commission is just one of them. Talking to providers, they clearly have the respective regulators in the other three nations, in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. They have Public Health England, Health and Safety, Food Standards, the Environment Agency, and then of course, multiple interactions with local government. So when we talk about regulation, it's already a fragmented landscape. And I'm delighted that Chris Day, Director of Engagement from CQC, has joined today as one part of that landscape. And we'll be talking more about how it might be a little bit more coordinated in future. Some of the key themes when we were discussing this were around local and national, where it's been very clear that there are local systems of health and social care and local solutions, but equally it's very important to have national and consistent standards that are applied consistently. And the irony is that actually a lot of care providers are national providers, whereas they have to deal with local markets. So they have a perspective over the whole country, which some of the people who are regulating and indeed buying services from them don't necessarily have. The second key theme is the integration of health and care. And CQC in some ways is ahead of the curve here because they do regulate both. They have a perspective across both health and care. But what we've seen is the fragmentation around delivery between the NHS and social care, around accountability, and also around funding. And one of the big questions is how we do better next time. And the final two thoughts are just practical solutions and how we address the whole issue, broader issue of public health, which I think is going to become much more in the political focus over the coming weeks. So finally, we want to keep the session a positive tone, focus on what we can do better, rather than focusing perhaps on some of the failures or challenges we've had over the past few weeks across the system. It's really very much how we can learn from that. And I think as we discussed this earlier with the panelists, the real question is if we have a second wave in 2 or 3 months' time, what are we going to do better then compared to what we've been doing over the last few months, rather than getting distracted around system change, which we've been discussing for decades. So I think we're trying to keep this focused and practical and positive in tone. We've had a number of questions from attendees, changes around regulation and specific questions around the Care Quality Commission. How can it promote best practice? How will it be looking to perhaps encourage providers to upgrade their infrastructure to minimize infection next time? What is the expert opinion on the way the CQC has handled the pandemic? Will there be new regulations around room sizes? And how will CQC empower employers to perhaps take more independent positive action as they're managing things on the ground day to day? In terms of changes around the market, how will judicial review benefit residents, staff, and relatives? How do we think private equity will look at this market post-COVID? And then the rights of residents, relatives, staff, and employees. What is the clinical picture for older people with lack of tests, and what legal challenges do we think may come out of that? What rights do small businesses have who haven't been able to access grants? Is there a risk of corporate manslaughter charges being brought? How possible is it that the government's contingency plans will actually have a bearing on some of those corporate manslaughter cases? What rights do relatives and residents have to see their loved ones? So I think there's some consistent themes there. We're just going to see whether we can get everyone logged on to Slido, which is the tool we use both for the live polling, but also for the Q&A. So we've got several hundred people listening into this webinar. And in order to triage the Q&A, we want to use Slido because you can upvote the questions. So if you go to slido.com in your browser or on your iPad or tablet or on your iPhone or smartphone, literally just put in slido.com in the browser, and you will end up with this window here where it says joining as a participant #event code, and just put in R&R for the title of the webinar. Click join an existing event, and you should end up with a screen that looks like this, not saying dental and COVID I might add, but risk and regulation. And click on Q&A if you want to ask the speaker a question or any of the panelists. Type your question and then submit it. And then there's a poll here as well, and we've got a live poll running as we speak. So if you're able to vote in that poll, that would be great. And I'll put the poll up so we can see how we're doing. We can see we've had 22 people log in. And the poll question is how to achieve faster, better responses for the next pandemic. Do we think it's about health and care strategy coordinated from day one? Do we think it's about clarity and consistency of advice? Do we think it's about a clearer chain of command? And we've had a number of people discussing whether actually at a time of crisis, you need a more military approach to this, where you do have a hierarchical cascaded command with a single point of contact. Or is it about better, faster access to emergency funding? And that's particularly in the context, for example, of the £600 million that Helen Whately MP announced for infection control, where we've seen the way that's been delivered and the bureaucracy around it really take away a lot of the benefits of what could have been a very, very sensible approach to helping providers on the front line. For example, it can't be used to buy PPE in some circumstances. So we will let that run in the background. And just to return to the panelists, I'm absolutely delighted that we've got such a fantastic lineup of panelists. We've got quite a lot to get through, so I'm encouraging them to stick to their 5 minutes or so. But we're really two halves to this. The first is with Chris Day representing the regulators and Vic Rayner representing the sector more broadly, as she has many, many members. And then Stuart Marchant from Bevan Britton, who's a regulatory lawyer, setting the scene from a more objective, or not more objective, but a more legalistic perspective in terms of how the regulator has to balance effectively the demands of individual service users who want people to be held to account and providers who wish to have a relationship which is open and transparent and encourages them to deliver a high quality service. It's not an easy solution. We then have the providers, so Jeremy Richardson, CEO of Four Seasons, Robert Kilgour, Executive Chair and Founder of Renaissance Care, also giving us a perspective from Scotland, Lynn Fern, the MD of Healthcare Management Solutions, and then Carlton Sadler, a partner from Bevan Britton, really wrapping up around the rights of individuals and providers within this sector. So on that, I am going to hand over to Chris, and we will start off with the regulator's perspective. Chris, over to you.
Hi, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this debate. As I think, as you said in your opening, there's a a multitude of organisations that are trying to give both advice and have oversight in this space, and it's always been complicated. What I'll try to do from our perspective is just to talk a bit about what we did at the start of the COVID epidemic, and what we've seen through the work that we've done over the last 10 to 12 weeks, and what that means for the future of what we might do moving forward. This is a slide I'm obliged to put out, which is our role and purpose. I think the most important words on that slide are the last few, where it says we encourage care services to improve. The point of being a regulator and have this conversation with colleagues, both internally and externally, isn't just to provide a view. We're not the referees of or the traffic wardens of health and care, where we just issue tickets and walk away. Our job is to encourage care services to improve. You may feel we do that less well or more well at different times. What I want to try and talk today is a bit about what we've done in the last 12 weeks and how we're going to take that forward. If you just go to the next slide for me. So, as you probably know, we did pause routine inspections, but we are continuing with responsive inspections. So, colleagues on this webcast may have been subject to an inspection. We have had a number of responsive inspections, responding mainly to concerns both from the providers themselves and also from people who either are people receiving services or from people in frontline positions in health and care. But one of the things we thought was important to do as the pandemic sort of unfolded, particularly in the first 4 weeks, was think about how we provide support for providers. We saw, and you could tell from the media, issues around PPE, issues around testing were important, and we knew there would be decisions that providers would have to make potentially quite quickly about how they were providing services. The emergency support framework was, deliberately designed to be a conversation, a series of questions that allow our inspectors to engage with providers around those difficult decisions that they're making to make sure they've got the right support. We've used it primarily as a vehicle to talk to a government and to talk to other national partners, particularly around the provision of PPE and testing in the early days. People may know on the call that we got involved in testing. We got involved in testing primarily because we saw it was a problem, and there's nowhere in our legislation that says that we should be anything to do with testing. But the point of trying to, in the early days of the pandemic, involve ourselves in that was precisely because we knew we needed to provide some support to care services at the front line. So we got involved in it until the government had a different solution through the web form and NHSX. But at the point of the emergency support framework and the point of the work we do now is mainly to make sure that colleagues who work in health and care have the support they need. They can deliver a safe care and treatment. We've taken some issues around the emergency support framework forward with both governments and with national organisations. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. If you just move to the next slide. I guess the three things that that I've learned and we've learned from the experience over the last sort of 10 weeks, and it isn't something that's new. This is stuff that we've talked about in State of Care over a number of years. The lack of information sharing about what is going on is crucially undermines the ability to have a good local system response. What I mean by that is the ability of commissioners and providers to work together to share information about what's going on in a local area, I think undermines the ability of all providers in the system to understand how services are working. One of the reasons why we created, for those colleagues who may be in domiciliary care, we created a domiciliary care tracker in week 3, week 4, precisely because there wasn't enough information coming back about how colleagues who work in domiciliary care were able to access PPE, able to access testing, and able to ensure that they had the right support that they needed. So I think information sharing and transparency of that information. Without that transparency, there's no learning, and I think it's important that we need to do it as well. It is important that we have a a role in making that work. And I think good analysis and good information sharing. We've used what we've done so far to publish a number of insight reports. First was published in last month. We've got the next one coming out next week. Just to give you a sense of what next week's talks about, it absolutely lays at the heart our response, the fact that this is managed at local system level, and that the ability of local leaders and local providers to come together with common purpose, to share money and to have common purpose around their intent, I think is defining how well local areas are able to respond to this. So we are, to go back to, I think, one of the questions that was in the preamble, we're using next week's edition to focus on what's worked well and where local systems have formed around particular issues, or where local providers have worked well together, but also to describe where we still think there are concerns. This is an ongoing conversation for us. We've talked about it in at least 2 state of cares, the lack of that system coordination. So we think, and from our perspective, what will be important for us is that we can use our role. And I think that as we look at in the next edition, we'll talk a bit more about systems. I think what it means for us, just moving on to the last slide and the end of my 5 minutes. I think it's important that we look at systems. When I joined CQC, we were very much an organisation, in fact the regulations set up to look at locations and care provision. I think increasingly it matters more that we can look at how systems, local systems are working, and examine what is working well and where there are still tensions. And I think we're going to use what we've learned in the first 10 weeks of the pandemic to do some rapid work in local systems to try and describe which areas have responded well to it and why. And this isn't to blame individual providers, this is to talk about what the system responsibilities are between health and care. And there have been really good and really poor responses at system level. And we want to do that quickly so that by August we've got a good review of that we can hopefully help stimulate debates at a local and at a national level. That's my 5 minutes, I think.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Chris. And I think, from my perspective, what I'm hearing there is that CQC has been very much aware that there's a lot changing out there. You've got this insight report coming out next week, which I think we all very much look forward to. And CQC is in some ways being put in the biggest position that you've turned yourself into a testing agency because no one else was doing it before passing that on to another entity. But in some ways, the fact that you had to step in is probably not a good sign in the first place. So I think it's a very neat segue into Vic Rayner, who represents National Care Forum and obviously has a number of members across the country to get her perspective from the provider side, but as a trade association rather than an individual provider on the front line. So Vic, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Henry. So I'm going to just try and romp through this quickly in the 5 minutes because there is lots to say about what's been going on and indeed what to focus on for the future. So I'm just going to start off with the issue about what we've learned over this last 10-week, 3-month period. And I think some of the regulation that I'll talk about will be specifically CQC, because obviously we've got CQC here and it's one of the dominant things that members talk to us about, and some of it will apply more broadly to a wider tranche of regulators, as you put in at the beginning. So I think the regulation tail has been largely one that has varied whether you look at the local or national picture, and I think I would pay due credit to Chris's local inspector colleagues across the country who, in feedback from our members, generally have played a very supportive and helpful role at a local level, whether that's about sourcing local PPE, supporting organisations to work through difficult decisions and others. And that role has been a largely positive role. I think the introduction, as Chris mentioned, of the emergency support framework has changed some of those relationships a little bit at a local level, and that may be something we want to discuss further, but generally that has been a supportive role. I think at a national level there has been a different experience, and I think it's really helpful that Chris has outlined some of the different decisions that they've had to make, some of the actions that they've taken, which appear to be about sort of CQC nationally finding a role for itself within the pandemic, or filling other gaps, filling other spaces. And I think that creates a level of confusion, and I think has perhaps meant that some of their possible role within the pandemic has been diluted because of some of that. And I think what's been very interesting and evident has been that the role that the regulator, they play as a regulator, and indeed most regulators, is a retrospective role. And I think what's been really challenging is during this pandemic, we've needed very urgently a real-time and indeed a future-focused role around both the data and information that we have about what's happening within services. And indeed today, the National Audit Office has come out with a report that talks about the lack of national data about who's living within care services and not even knowing a finite number. So there's all sorts of challenges around that, and I think that's been very difficult. In terms of rights, I think we made some very early decisions implemented within the legislation and into the discharge guidance to reduce people's rights, to reduce citizens' rights, some of the most vulnerable people's rights, and take away some of their choice and control, all things that were embedded within the Care Act and other pieces of legislation. We've stopped many people's voices being heard within that. We know now that this virus has taken a terrible toll on some particular parts of our communities, and often these are the parts of the community who have much less voice anyway. We know about older people, particularly people with dementia, those with learning disabilities, and a growing understanding of how it's affecting the BAME population. And I think that tells us something about, and we only know some of these things much later in the day than we should have done. The fact that it wasn't until the 28th of April that we had published by government and regulators some more up-to-date data on how many people were dying within services, almost 6 weeks into the pandemic, I think is a really represents some of that information. And also the fact that we didn't know about the level of impact on people with learning disabilities until even just in the last week or so tells us that. So that mantra of measure what you treasure is key. We could have the next one. What do we want CQC to do differently? Chris talked about systems reviews, absolutely. However, I think that they also had lots of oversight and information about how different parts of the system weren't working together. We had examples where GP practices were issuing, for example, do not resuscitate notices, and CQC having oversight of both the care and health in those localities, I think could have taken some much quicker action around that. We needed them to act fast and hard when it was really clear that systems were letting people down, and that was regularly notified by members and others around problems and challenges around PPE testing, etc., where it was clear systems were being letting down. Information sharing, great, you're doing some good stuff with the insight reports, but lots of that could have come out much earlier. Last week I think you released 300 great examples of good practice within COVID. I wonder why we waited till 300. Why didn't we have 50 in week 2 and 50 in week 4 kind of thing? I think that some of this is kind of, we're waiting too long to get this out. We need CQC to use the data that they have. And I think, I think there is a huge possible role for the regulator with that leadership and independence. And I think it's been hard for them as an organisation, and we found it hard that they haven't used and heard that. And I know there's an evaluation going on around CQC's role. I don't know if that's been launched yet, but I think it's coming out very shortly. So I encourage those listening in to get their voice heard too. I'll whip quickly through the next couple, Henry. So what do we need to embed and enhance those rights in the next 6 to 12 months? Well, we've got to learn from people. Very early on in the pandemic, and I'm not talking just about those who are using services, but also those working within them, we were hearing from members that all the information about COVID-19, who's got it, what the symptoms are, was not how it was manifesting within older people services particularly. But those voices weren't being heard, they weren't being listened to. So we've got to be much smarter to protect people's rights by listening to those who are on the front line. There's some good recognition of the skills and expertise of people working within care, but we've got to make sure that that is much more clearly recognised and heard right from the start. we need to look at data in a very different way. We can't wait for it to be verified and analysed. We need to raise those early flags and work on them together to find out what it is that they're telling us. We've got to recognise that all of those citizens count, and we have to ensure that that we're counting all of them within our data and making that part of our central policy focus. And that we've implemented a whole range of blanket policies around social isolation, around distancing from family and loved ones, and those have had massive detrimental impacts on some citizens, much more than many others. So we've got to get some of those things right now as providers. We need to get some of those rights embedded in about visiting, connecting up with people, and essentially having really transparent communication with those relatives and residents particularly. And finally, if we can look about what we want to change in relation to the next slide, Henry, if we can, about embedding and enhancing regulation in the next 6 to 12 months. Regulation across the board, not just CQC, will be stirring back into action. We need those regulators to remember what the eye of the storm looked like. It's very easy in this very weird COVID world, weeks turn into months, turn into years, and it feels like an awful long time ago. March, April feels like a long time ago. It's not, and the crisis and the eye of the storm was very hugely significant, and regulation can't forget that, and regulators can't expect things to have been delivered in a normal way within that environment. We need this regulator to stay in supportive mode. That I think a notion that we might go back to a normal level of regulation with a normal type of inspection regime is not feasible and will not be helpful. We need the regulator for the next 12 to 18 months, I suspect, to recognise the detrimental impact of this on services, and also to understand that their role in terms of making or breaking organisations will be huge. Every provider out there will be worrying about insurance, about financing and about occupancy levels, and actually the regulator's perspective on organisations will have ever more significant weight in all those negotiations. And indeed their ability to go and share localised data with other commissioners, other regulators will be very important, but we need to be aware that that will be hugely sensitive as well. And that actually the shock waves of regulatory decisions will be very unwelcome. So yes, just a reiteration in the sense that we need them to work in a supportive way. And if they thought, we hope many organisations will survive this, but if they thought organisations were at a tipping point previously, what we don't need is a kind of cudgel of regulation that will sort of send people sliding off down the pole much quicker or faster than they need to. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that. I think that puts it very, very nicely, Vic, from the sector's perspective. What I take away from that also, though, is that this is a case where a lot of the information is already in the system, and this is as much about making sure that we share that information in an efficient way. We share it fast enough as well. And it's not that it isn't there, it's how we're operating at the moment. And part of that is making sure that providers are trusting of the regulator, that they want to share information quickly as well. I'm now actually going to turn to Carlton Sadler, who's the regulatory partner at Bevan Britain, just to set the perspective from a legal angle. So Carlton, over to you.
Thanks, Henry. Yes, I was just going to talk a little bit from my perspective. For those people who don't know Bevan Britain, we're lawyers who advise the independent sector providers and investors on a range of issues. My particular input into this is around healthcare regulation, and as Henry mentioned, there's a whole range of regulatory regimes which providers have to contend with, but my focus was just to pick up on the legal aspects for CQC and what this may mean, which is sort of following on from a lot of the themes Vic was mentioning. So just a very sort of quick recap on some of the context which the sector's been facing, and these are only bits of it, obviously, but hospital discharge services requirements. We've seen 25,000 people discharged from hospitals into care homes from mid-March to mid-April, when testing was far from widespread, and the challenges that brought for the sector, at a time when the official guidance around visiting was that the only people who should be restricted from visitors were people who actually were suspected of having COVID. Now, I appreciate that in practice, a lot of providers locked down a lot quicker than that, but practice was varied across the sector. PPE obviously needs to be mentioned. The guidance for care homes and the care sector generally was belated. Providers have had to grapple with frequently changing guidance in terms of what it means for them. Supplies have been, or the sort of national stockpile deliveries have been pretty sparse. And the on-paper support, I think there's an issue there that the on-paper support is probably there. The supply lines I mentioned as being there, but clients we've spoken to have said that they've had real challenges accessing meaningful supplies from those sources. And the quote there of marigolds and bin liners is from Nadra Ahmed, who was saying that her members at the NCA, were many of them were very desperate around the supply of masks and gloves, and when it runs out, that's what you're left with. So the latest data of what that means that I've been able to find is in terms of the impact on the sector in care homes is 40%, according to PHE as of the end of May, 40% of care homes with suspected outbreaks. And from CQC's data from the Insight report Chris has mentioned, I think dated 8th of May, the data there for domiciliary care agencies was 19% of agencies. So that's the sort of context. And just stealing from Chris's Insight report again, which I would echo, is an excellent publication just to sort of give an overview of things. But you see there some of the data around domiciliary care supplies. 28%, I think it is, of providers in London and the London and the northeast, I think, who also northwest, who only got 7 days worth of supply, and in London it's 6% who've got less than 2 days supply. So what that situation means in terms of the risks it creates for the sector is an ongoing risk. We've had the risk in the peak, but I think as we move into a situation of easing and hopefully easing of lockdown, there are continuing risks for the sector that providers have to grapple with. Clearly, there's the direct risks of COVID around infection control for residents, service users. Those risks also impacting on staff availability, and the CQC Insight report mentioning the alarming situation of managers in small providers having to choose whether to self-isolate themselves or to continue working because of staff shortages. And as we move forward in terms of giving more weight to service users' rights, facilitating contact, visiting, etc., that obviously carries other infection risks that need to be factored into that and thought through and worked through. But clearly also for providers a whole range of other risks arising from this sector that they need to grapple with. The ability to access business as usual healthcare services being impacted. What happens when residents have had falls? Can you access services in the way that you might normally want to? DNARs have been mentioned, where if there are still concerning DNARs on the books, will care providers be held to account for those? When potentially that may have been a system response beyond their control. I'm not going to go through all of these, but some of the other issues there, staffing levels, possible drugs changes that create a new need for services to deliver medication differently, as well as morale and burnout, and just the general concern that we're all working with new and unfamiliar systems here, which is bound to create difficulties across the board for people delivering care. And all of those, in a regulatory sense, impact potentially on the compliance with the Regulation 12 and safe care and treatment. So what has the regulator said about this? That the chief inspectors made a joint statement across all domains fairly early on in April about expecting services to do the best to keep people safe, but making the point, that they are a regulator, they do have regulatory powers, and if they see evidence of a risk of harm, they will use those powers. Now, I think, as I mentioned, I think it's inevitable that there is an awful lot of risk around, and as Vic says, this is, there needs to be a recollection of what things were like in the eye of the storm, and things can't be judged in the way they would be normally. It's true and absolutely true and should be acknowledged that CQC has done a lot in terms of the emergency support framework and the support that provides. As I mentioned, the example about helping people, helping providers get and loan PPE, but also the wider support CQC has done in terms of stepping in on testing. But again, the support framework stresses, as it has to, that CQC may need to flip into inspection mode depending on what they find. And just a final word on the support framework. The summary record that CQC produced is sent to providers. It's not going to be published, unlike normal inspection reports. But I do think, and because of that, CQC has said there's not an opportunity for providers to challenge any factual inaccuracies in those reports. I do think providers just need to be aware of that and to log any challenges, because there is a risk that those reports could find their way into the public domain under a Freedom of Information Act request. So skipping through, finally, I suppose, the next slide, if that's available. CQC has said, here's a quote from the Insight report, and this has come from Ted Baker around the hospital sector, but about sharing good practice, as people have mentioned, but again, making the point, and this is, I think, the first sort of hint about possible enforcement coming down the track, about using enforcement powers if unsatisfactory practice puts people at risk. And I think my point is that there is the potential for risk here, despite the best endeavours of the sector. So how will CQC judge that? They make the specific point about investigating some hospitals who may have been less than candid about the COVID status of people discharged to care homes. And they make the general point that they'll be proportionate and consider the pressures on providers in deciding what action they take. And that's, that's absolutely right that they should do that. I think that the challenge for providers, if they face the sharp end of enforcement, is how they would be able to show that they took all reasonable steps to safeguard the position, given the varying practice across the sector at different times, the differing local requirements we've seen around PPE from certain community health teams, and the fact that sometimes the reality on the ground doesn't necessarily match what it says on the tin around testing and PPE. So I think I welcome what Chris says about CQC putting together a definition of what good looks like, but echo Vic's comments that really does need to reflect the fact that that is going to be very different in the eye of the storm, and I think different from people in different locations.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Carlton. And I think in some ways that really emphasizes the fact that there are lots of different regulators here. And I think one nice example was that, in fact, Public Health England are responsible for a certain amount of identifying who has coronavirus in care homes as a result of the Coronavirus Act. And yet Public Health England officials have been conspicuous by their absence during this crisis. So I think on that note, I'd very much like to turn over to the providers who are dealing with multiple regulators, multiple legislation. In one of our previous webinars, someone indicated there have been 21 different sections of guidance about what to do around PPE. So first up is Jeremy Richardson from Four Seasons Healthcare. And Jeremy, over to you.
Thanks, Henry. I've tried to keep this very simple by just putting one slide together, which I hope will make it easy for people to follow. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to skip through the first two bits of this and then focus on the third one, because conscious that that's probably where most of people's interest will lie. So who are we? Well, the Four Seasons Group is one of the UK's largest care home operators. We've got 187 care homes across a number of different jurisdictions. And we operate two brands, which until December were operated as standalone businesses. They were brought together in December, so now everything is run under one team. That's probably the only change that's happened recently within the group. I thought it would be useful just to touch briefly on the impact of COVID and how we have been affected. I mean, the top bullet says it all. We've been significantly affected. And that's in line with, I think, the experience of all other operators in the sector. I was interested in Carlton's slides that 40% of care homes have suffered at least one suspected or confirmed case of COVID. In conversation with all of the operators in the sector, I think they would challenge that data, because we're seeing infection rates, or did see infection rates, I should say, at the peak of up to 65% of homes. That 40% figure, I think, is woefully low. The good news is that's come down, so we only have COVID now in 13.7% of our homes. So I think that is illustrative of the fact that we are through the peak. Tragically, we've had 531 deaths, 400 of which have occurred in our homes. The remainder have occurred in hospitals. And I think, you know, I'm very mindful that when we talk about the number of deaths, it's very easy to put them on a slide and talk about stats, but behind every single one of those deaths is a story, is a person, is a relative, is somebody who is going through real grief. And one of the things I think that we need to focus on as we come through the crisis is maintaining the balance between statistics, process, and action, and actually understanding that there are people who are affected by this crisis in really different ways. At its peak, we had 11.3% of our team off sick. So those were people who were either shielding or self-isolating. I'm pleased to say, again, that's substantially reduced as we've come through the peak. So that position is easing dramatically. And our occupancy has dropped from a peak of 89.5 to a current 79.8%. So that's a decline of 9.7%. Again, I know that's consistent across the piece, because we are sharing data as operators. Again, in the interest of being open and transparent with one another, I think it's important that we learn as much as we can. There was a question on Slido that asked, how long is it going to take for occupancy to return? Well, I think that's the million-dollar question. Nobody really knows the answer, but I think it could be anywhere up to 2 years, perhaps even longer than that. What we have to recognise is that every operator is going to be in a similar position. Occupancy levels in the sector are going to be in the 70s. And so everybody is going to have spare capacity, and therefore building that back up is going to take time. And of course, we need to do it safely. You can't just simply fill beds. It can't be any head on any pillow. We've got to do this sensibly. We've got to do it safely. And therefore, I think that occupancy rebuild is going to take a significant period of time. And then I thought the last stat to share was around PPE and other infection control costs. So year on year, we've seen those costs rise from £250,000 to 2.7 million. So that's a tenfold increase in costs that we have incurred. And I think one of the things we need to contemplate going forward is that certainly in the short, perhaps even in the medium term, this is going to be an embedded cost into our business. And that will need to be recognised, because I don't think that life is going to return to normal, or whatever a new normal looks like in care homes, for a significant period of time to come. In terms of regulation, again, I've tried to keep this simple, because I think there are a number of things that we might want to think about. One or two of these points have been touched on already. You know, the reality is that regulation in this country is extremely complicated, and poor Chris is sitting here representing the CQC, but he is only a very small part of that regulatory framework, because we have to deal with local authorities, with local safeguarding, with Public Health England, with the CQC in England, the Care Inspectorate in Scotland, the RQIA in Northern Ireland. The list goes on and on. And it is incredibly complicated. And for an operator, you know, my plea would be, let's simplify. You know, we need to use this crisis as an opportunity to simplify some of these organisations. I come from a background of the leisure sector, and I've worked in small and large companies. And what you see in large companies is that bureaucracy builds itself. Well, that multiplies itself many times over when you put various different agencies together. They all need to justify their existence. They all need to demonstrate that they're having an impact, in inverted commas, and therefore the more people involved, the more complicated it becomes. So my first plea would be, let's use this as an opportunity to dramatically simplify the way that the sector is managed. It's disjointed, and that's in part as a consequence of the complicated nature of the way that it's regulated at the moment. You know, Chris made the plea for information sharing. I couldn't agree with him more. But the problem is that when you share information right now, it's being used for the wrong reasons, because people are using information to justify their own existence and to demonstrate that they are having an impact, and not necessarily a positive impact. I think we should be sharing information for what it's worth. I think we should be as transparent as we can possibly be. But in order for that to be effective, everybody has to be aligned, and everybody has to be trying to achieve the same outcome. What I see in regulation, and I talk about that in its most general sense, is a degree of risk aversion. The worst thing that you can do is make a decision that's wrong, because if you do that, somebody's going to get the big stick out and whack you. Nobody is encouraged to take the bold decisions, to make the big calls, because the risk of getting it wrong far outweighs the benefits of any innovation. And I think that is something that's held this sector back for a very long time indeed, and something that I think we should think about. We have to create an environment where people feel empowered and they feel motivated and they feel inspired to make change in a safe way. And I say that because, you know, listening to Carlton a little bit earlier, you know, I slumped into my chair feeling incredibly depressed, because he's probably right when he says, you know, what you need to do is to get your legal ducks in a row. You know, for heaven's sake, we're in the middle of a crisis. We should be trying to figure out how to do the best we possibly can for our residents, for our relatives, and for our team members. And I'm being asked, quite rightly, to deploy percentages of my time to make sure that I'm legally robust for when the big boulder comes rolling down the hill post the crisis. That is not a good use of my time, but because of the way we are set up right now, it's something I have to be very mindful of and think about. And for every % of my time I spend dealing with lawyers and accountants and regulators, it is less time than I've got to really do the things that we need to do, which is look after residents and relatives. The point that one or two people have made already about regulation being reactive and not proactive, I think is absolutely right. And then the last point, which I was going to dwell on, is really what I think we fundamentally need to focus on here. Because if we're going to be more transparent, which I think we need to be, if we're going to share more data, which I think we need to do, and if we're going to simplify the system, we have to create an environment where people feel comfortable in doing that. And my observation would be that this sector for far too long has suffered from a culture of fear. There is no such thing as a mistake. Nobody is prepared to accept that you can make a mistake anymore. We need to find somebody to blame. It needs to be somebody's fault, and therefore somebody needs to be hung out to dry. And if you create that environment, people will not share data, they will not be transparent, they will not do all of the things that we're talking about that I think will make this sector more progressive and more effective. And I would really like us to focus on changing the culture in this sector. And that means that our regulators needs to be aligned with everybody focused on a common goal of creating better outcomes and accepting that people aren't going to get things right all of the time. Again, when I was looking at Slido earlier on, there was another question that said, and I think this was addressed to Chris, are the CQC going to be supportive? I really hope so, you know, because actually the sector needs the CQC and the Care Inspectorate and the RQIA and everybody else involved in this process to be supportive as we come out of this crisis, because we're all trying to make a difference. And I worry enormously that as we move into the public inquiry, the inevitable public inquiry that will come, and it should come, by the way, I worry that that is going to be set up such that actually it's all about pinning the blame on somebody. You know, what that public inquiry should be about is learning the lessons in a constructive fashion so that we do a better job next time round. And my worry, of course, is that that's not going to be the case. It's going to be simply about pointing the finger at people and everybody else being able to stand back and say, well, it wasn't my fault. And you can see that happening already. You know, the government are blaming the scientists are blaming the government, other people are blaming domestic animals in their household. You know, everybody is responsible for this crisis apart from the people who are actually trying to fix the problem, and that is a real issue. Now, the only thing I haven't put on this slide are, you know, what would I do differently next time, or what do I think we should do differently next time? And I think there are three things that I would really like us to focus on if we go through a second wave of coronavirus, or indeed if we don't, but in anticipation of another viral pandemic, whether it be that flu or anything else that comes later. You know, what are the things I think we should do? Well, you know, again, looking at the first poll on Slido, it was about what is the thing people think we should focus on most. And 50% of respondents, when I last looked, said we need a single chain of command. When you move into a crisis, you need to move into crisis management. And in my view, that means suspending the normal rules of engagement. You know, the government can quite rightly say that they've invested £3.8 billion in the social care sector in the last 15 months. They've just invested 600 million in infection control. That should be hugely applauded and a big win. And yet they've managed to almost snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, because having put the money in, they've fed it through the sieve of local government. And it's just got furred up in the arteries of bureaucracy, and the money isn't getting through to the front line. And we have to move into a situation where, under a crisis, we run through crisis management. Single point of command, much more effective, get the things that get needed into the hands of the people who need it as quickly as possible. Second thing is, well, it depends how literal you want me to be, but I'll go for the 5 Ps and not the 7 Ps, because the last 2 Ps you start to move into choice language. The 5 Ps, proper planning prevents poor performance. There was no planning in this crisis. We didn't learn from the flu pandemic of 2015. We didn't learn from the government role play in 2016, Project Cerberus or whatever it was called. We need to learn from this. So put the planning in place so that we don't then start knee-jerk reacting, because that's what's happening at the moment. The government will stand up at the lectern, they will make an announcement, and then running around behind the scenes are a bunch of people trying to figure out how to implement the announcement. That is the wrong way to do things. We have to do it the other way around. And my third point, my last point would be, look, be honest. Again, back to this point about culture, we all need to be honest with one another. People have made mistakes in this pandemic, and that's hardly surprising, because it's a one in what we hope is a 100-year event. You can't prepare, however much preparation you do, you can't fully prepare for a 1 in a 100-year event. People will make mistakes. Be prepared to be honest about it. Don't lie. When Matt Hancock stands up and says that the government threw a protective ring around care homes from February the 27th, that is, well, if I'm being kind, it's disingenuous. If I'm being a little bit more brutal, it's a blatant lie. And it's not helpful, because what that then does is it consumes huge amounts of energy as people run around trying to justify something that is palpably untrue. And all the energy that is used in protecting a position that's clearly not sustainable is deflected away from actually fixing the problem. So let's be honest with one another, stand up and admit that we haven't got everything right. I don't think anybody is going to hold that against people. What they hold against people is the lack of trust, which comes from not being honest with the public. People are not stupid. So those would be the 3 points that I would hope we might take on board if we get to a second peak, or indeed another pandemic of a different nature going forward.
Jeremy, thank you very much indeed for that. I think my 3 big takeaways there: chain of command, planning, and then honest, open and trusting. Whether we can get that in place in 3 months' time, actually there's a good chance that we can if we do focus on that delivery. I'm conscious of time. We've got 2 more speakers from the provider side, and then Stuart from Bevan Britain. So I'm going to hand straight over to Robert to give us a Scottish perspective on all this. And in some ways, I think we're almost more interested in the differences from what's happening in England. But also, Robert's been in the sector for many, many years, and maybe some of the lessons that he thinks we can learn as a result of this. So Robert, over to you.
Thank you, Henry. You can hear me all right, can you?
Can indeed.
Good, good. It was nice to see the Four Seasons logo there that I designed at a £500 fixed fee cost 32 years ago. It's nice to see it still being used. As Henry said, I'm Scottish. I founded Four Seasons in 1988, leaving in 2000. Founded Renaissance Care in 2004. And we currently, where I'm executive chairman, have 15 care homes throughout Scotland and 1,100 staff. And I split my time between my home in London and my home in Fife in Scotland. Next slide, please. Yes, the timeline. This is our timeline, not the Scottish Government's timeline. We had partial lockdown on the 1st of March, full lockdown on the 11th of March, but from that period we did allow, with correct PPE, end of life visits right from that 11th of March through. We started all staff wearing masks in all occasions, from including homes that had no cases, from the 1st of April. We didn't have it fully operational across all homes till about the 2nd week of April. And our first positive case was in one of our Edinburgh care homes, and that was on the resident was the 3rd of April. Next slide, please. Our experience, I'd first like to say that I have never been prouder in 30 years of being in the sector, of being in the sector, and of the amazing staff that have really been amazing and shown such great dedication, doing double shifts and in some cases doing triple shifts. They've been amazing at the front line, dealing with this tsunami that has faced us, and I'm very, very proud of them. On PPE supply, I would say yes, we never ran out of PPE, but it was a close run thing, as Wellington said about Waterloo. But a bit of Dunkirk spirit and getting PPE supplies from nail bars, dentists, and construction companies actually was, we got through it. Obviously costs went hugely up in that area. Hospital discharges in Scotland, big problem there. 921 were discharged into care homes without testing in March, and a further 510 in April. And we didn't start in Scotland. I don't understand why we started testing NHS discharges to care homes on the 21st of April, 6 days after England did. On testing, I'll say a bit more about that in a minute, but it certainly, we have experienced it across our 15 homes as very much of a postcode lottery, and that's been a big concern. On funding, well, it's been very, very slow. I mean, the Scottish Government have given more money to pubs, restaurants, and nail bars that are closed than they've to date given to care homes that are open and fighting in the front line against COVID. It has, of late, in the last week or so, improved a little. More local authorities are engaging with us in this regard, and I'm hopeful that we will, some extra funding will come in, but it's not too little too late, because anything would be welcome. But they are certainly not passing on the money that they're getting from Westminster to the Scottish Government. Is not being passed on to local authorities, who are not passing it on to us. On the regulating side, I just really want to dwell on this a little. We have the Scottish Government, who last month brought in a new law that they can take over care homes that are in financial trouble or not operating in what they consider to be a correct and safe manner. And also part of that law was that each NHS, local NHS and local authority was to meet daily to discuss the performance daily of the independent care homes in their area, and go in and inspect and provide reports on what they find to the Care Inspectorate in Scotland and to the Scottish Government. Public Health Scotland were a bit sort of power crazy initially. They're quieting down a bit, but there is, across the Care Inspectorate and Public Health Scotland, there have been quite a lot of different local interpretations within even a small country like Scotland. What happens in Aberdeen from CQC or Public Health Scotland is different to Edinburgh, different to Glasgow. So that's been a difficult one to deal with. And obviously but the Care Inspector in Scotland have been quite supportive and have been quite helpful in the main. And they are now back doing inspections with the one key question, and that's all they're focusing on, which is how good is the care and support during the pandemic? And there's some sub-questions, but that's really all they're focusing on when they're coming in. One thing to say on PPE, before I move on to data, is that we did get one delivery to each care home of 1 week's supply direct from Scottish Government between the 20th and 26th of April. One delivery of 1 week's supply. That's all we got direct from Scottish Government. 141 residents in 9 of our 15 homes tested positive. 48 sadly died following the positive test in 8 of these homes. Plus also that includes hospital. Some of them, a few of them were in that 48 were in hospital when they died. 10% of our residents with no symptoms tested positive, and 7% of staff with no symptoms tested positive. So this is resulting from Scottish Government selective blitz testing of care home staff and residents that have no symptoms. I think these figures are quite interesting. It shows that the 7% staff with no symptoms were probably, sadly, in part responsible for the spread in care homes, with the R number in care homes, according to Professor Hugh Pennington, being north of 10. I repeat that, north of 10, which shows that once it does get in, it does spread like wildfire, sadly. A maximum 15% staff off, sick or shielding at any one time. That was our peak, if you like, from that. Next slide, please. 8% at them is the current staff off, sick and shielding. But within that 2.8% of that is COVID-related sick or shielding. The rest is generally off with either, could be stress, could be, so you could argue, is stress COVID-related or not? But that's how we've identified the figures. Some good news, I mean, 91 residents that did test positive have recovered, thanks to the great work of our staff. And that's something that is often forgotten by the media, which is a shame. Only 2 positive, currently we only have 2 positive residents in one of our homes. At peak, we had suspected or actual cases of COVID in 10 of our 15 homes. Current issues, regular staff do need testing, ideally twice weekly, but we'd settle for weekly, but it's certainly not happening. More funding support, absolutely. The money needs to come through to the front line. It's not. Relatives returning in a safe manner is a big one, as far as, and we're looking at thermal imaging machines and other things that might give confidence to relatives to come back in. Relatives are a key part of care homes. They're a key in the circle of care. They're a very key part, and it's something that we're keen to get back in a safe manner as soon as possible. Staff burnout and mental health support is another key area we're focusing on. And the Scottish Government's Test and Protect scheme is a big worry for us at the moment, that if a few of our staff on shift get a text saying that they've to isolate, then does that mean that everybody on that shift that they've been in contact with has to go home? And how do we replace those staff? So that's a big concern, as is also the preparation that we're doing for the threat of a second wave. We prepare for the worst and hope for the best, and that's something that we're doing at the minute. And the final slide. Yes, well, I mean, I'm an entrepreneur, so I'm on the half full side of the glass, if you like. Yes, it's a very challenging and uncertain time we face, but I am positive about the future. I'm very proud of what we do and what we have done, and I'm excited and positive about the future. Yes, it's going to be difficult, but I'm certainly up for the challenge, and I'm looking forward to getting stuck into it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Robin. And my takeaway from that actually is that we're getting a very consistent message here. So as you look into the prospect of a second wave, better testing, better access to immediate funding to pay for those significant PPE costs. And you indicated you got 1 week's of supply from the Scottish Government, but we heard from Jeremy that his costs have basically gone up very, very significantly, sort of 100-fold. And then I think just coordination in terms of consistency of message from the Care Inspectorate and Public Health Scotland. So all very, very similar messages to what we've been hearing from the other speakers. I guess the one difference is just around the Scottish Government's approach to what is some quite aggressive legislation as more of a stick than a carrot, and flies in the face of what Chris has been talking about in terms of, you know, that culture of trying to ensure people share information without fear of retribution. And I guess that is perhaps a more concerning development. On that, I am going to now hand over to Lynn. Lynn Fearn's the Managing Director of Healthcare Management Solutions, who actually manage a number of different care homes for different providers. And Lynn, just given time, I'll hand straight over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Henry. Thanks. Morning, everyone. HTMS are currently managing around 70 care services across England, Scotland and Wales. And we were the first, one of the homes we managed was the first homes to have active contact with COVID back in mid-February. So at that point, there was no guidance. Nobody was talking about COVID in care homes. And so we were straight out of the blocks with decisions made by ourselves, really. We set out at the beginning with some guiding principles. We understood quite early on that we needed to flatten our organisational structures so that we could work collaboratively across the organisation, bringing in anybody and everybody that had got some skill and visibility around this situation. It was really important to us that we made timely decisions, we were responsive, that we quickly analysed what was going on, and I think the thing that has been the biggest challenge has been the comms, and other panellists have spoken about the difficulties of the consistency of the message and of understanding different pieces of guidance at different times in a rapidly changing environment. But from our point of view, keeping the message clear and straight and honest with our home managers has been the defining guide of this pandemic. We also were conscious that very early on that maintaining essential supply lines would be really important to us getting through this. Now, the next slide, please, Henry. So what did we do? We set up a daily COVID action team that met 7 days a week for a very long time. We briefed our managers daily, and we now do that 3 times a week. But we provide an updated guidance in the form of a Q&A document every day to our managers. We wanted to make sure that they had good support, not just from the centre and from the leadership team, but within their own peer group. So we set up various managers' WhatsApp groups and other social media platforms that help them keep in touch with one another. It was really important that we focused on staff morale issues and initiatives. There's not many people have spoken about the fun that people have had in care homes, the residents and the staff over the last few weeks. There have been some amazing things that have gone on, and we've tried to share that with everybody, including commissioners, regulators, everybody else, so that people felt that real life was still carrying on. I think one of our biggest challenges was meeting with our suppliers, a particular focus on PPE. We've heard all about the problems that people have had. Our experience has been similar to what Robert said. We've never run out of PPE. We've always had about 3 weeks supply in every service, but it's needed focus, it's needed time, it's needed us to be on it every day and to make sure that people were clear about their role and what role they played in that. So we set up our head office as a logistics hub and a warehouse, which freaked the insurers, I think, but we used staff to get PPE to where it was needed, when it was needed. And because we were in such regular contact with individual home managers on a daily basis, we knew where things needed to go. So we've used new technology in all sorts of ways to support new methods of working, whether that be getting information out there, getting supplies out there, supporting our governance framework. We've adopted new ways of working throughout the business. Right from the beginning, we adopted a position of total transparency with all our stakeholders, staff, residents, relatives, regulators, everybody. This was new to us, and other people have said it. It was brand new. We couldn't have planned for this in its entirety, and sometimes we got it wrong. We made decisions and they weren't the right ones. So, but we decided, we've talked about culture, and our approach was very much, let's review, let's revise, let's learn, let's move on. There's no point in having a culture of blame. So our experience, was it challenging? Yes, it was challenging. It continues to be challenging, and I think we all know that coming out is going to be a lot more difficult than going in. We didn't expect anything less. Was it frustrating? Yes, at times it was frustrating. But we've heard a lot in the media about care providers feeling abandoned. Did we feel abandoned? No, we didn't. We had great support from local agencies. Our contacts within CQC and within the other regulatory bodies were accessible to us, and they provided support and advice, and that was really useful. We heard lots about care homes being a war zone. That's not what our staff are telling us. It's not what our residents are telling us. It's not what our visitors and families are telling us. So that wasn't our experience. But are we learning every day? Yes, every single day we're learning something new about this. We're learning how to manage going forward. Next slide, please, Henry. So what does the next 6 months look like for HCMS and our care homes? Obviously continue need for PPE. I don't see that ending anytime soon. I think we will be using this in the way we are well into the end of the year. Ongoing restrictions for visiting and challenges around keeping families in touch and respecting people's rights to have the right to a family life. I agree with everything that people have said about occupancy. Yes, it is under pressure. It will be slow to recover, and probably I would concur with Jeremy that probably 2 years is about the right time frame. There'll continue to be huge cost pressures. It makes my hair curl when I hear that the next lot of gloves that we might need to purchase might be 400% more expensive than they were pre-COVID. We will see a reduced need for agency staff, and I think that's one of the positives that will come out of this situation. I think the risks associated with bringing people into your home who are not your own employees is well documented, and I think people are less tolerant of that now. We're seeing improvements in the recruitment landscape, and I think we'll see that, and it's incumbent on us all to make the sector attractive for people who have got skills that we need and want to come into it. We're seeing new ways of working across the whole organisation, and that's been a really positive experience. And so what do we need to recover? We need all the things that everybody has talked about. We need consistency of approach from central government and local authorities. We absolutely need less duplication of inspection from multiple agencies. It's one of the things our staff and our managers are telling us, that because they're in lockdown, they're able to spend more time with their residents. They're able to spend more time with families. They're able to spend more time with each other. And that's because they've not got every man and his dog coming into their home checking the same thing all the time. And what do our service users and our families tell us? It's that we lack as a sector. We lack time, and we're spending time, or we were spending time duplicating a lot of things. We need joined up funding between health and social care. We've talked about it for years, but the funds need to follow the people, and we need to work together to achieve that. And I would concur with everybody else. Transparency of data is so important. Transparency of decision making is so important. But we will only get that. It will only happen if people feel that they can trust the agencies that they're sharing that information with, and that it's not going to be grabbed out of context in 6, 12, 18 months' time, when some contracts manager or a regulatory inspector decides to spend 3 hours in an archive cupboard looking back at some records of what your staff rota was at that point, as Vic so eloquently put it, in the eye of the storm. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Lynn. And I think actually the messaging there is reassuringly consistent, today, which is that the regulators need to be consistent in what they're asking of people. They need to be coordinated to reduce duplication. The funding needs to be joined up and the data needs to be shared. So I don't think anybody is surprised by that. I guess the challenge is how to make it happen, and which ones of those we can actually make a difference to in the next 3 months. So I think, I think we'll probably extend this for another sort of 10 or 15 minutes, because I think there's a lot of really good Q&A. But Stuart, I'll just hand over to you to just put the perspective from the rights of some of these stakeholders. And then we will crack on with the Q&A, which is on the Slido. Stuart, over to you. I think you're on mute, Stuart.
COVID-19.
Oh.
Okay, I'm on there. Okay, so I'm going to look at the impact of COVID-19 from a human rights perspective, and to look at the impact of that on the care sector and how the courts are saying rights should be protected and maximised. And against that background, look at what this means practically for providers. Now, when it comes to human rights, it's always a case of balancing different rights against each other. The real effect of COVID-19 is that people are dying, notwithstanding the Article 2 right to life, the obligation to protect life. And we will see in due course what is said about whether or not too many people have died. I'm sure everyone will have a view on that. There's also the right to liberty that's enshrined in Article 5. We know that people are being required to isolate, sometimes against their wishes, sometimes amounting to a deprivation of their liberty. And we know that people have a right to a family life. Whilst against that, we see restrictions on visiting, restrictions on access to loved ones and to family. There's also a case to consider, well, whose rights are we talking about? Yes, we've got residents, patients, and people living in their own homes receiving services, but also the rights of individual staff and the wider rights and concerns about the public, which all get thrown into the mix. And the job of everyone in trying to navigate this is to find a balance, to make compromises where necessary, while seeking to protect the rights of everybody, and maintaining relationships with individuals, maintaining relationships with regulators, as we've heard, to make sure that there is evidence and we can show that positive practices are being followed. Now, it's somewhat alarming that when the guidance comes from Europe on how we manage people who are deprived of their liberty as a result of COVID-19, that guidance comes from the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture. But be that as it may, that committee issued a statement of principles on the 20th of March, which included the fact that any restriction on a person deprived of their liberty to prevent the spread of COVID-19 should have a legal basis. It should be necessary, it should be proportionate, and it must be respectful of human dignity and restricted in time, so we can't have a blanket bans on all these things for as long as we want. And people who are deprived of their liberty need to be able to understand, notwithstanding their background and their capacity levels, in simple language, what is happening to them. It's also worth noting that the Council of Europe said that concerted efforts should be made to reassess the need to contain people, including releasing and discharging people from social care homes where that's possible. Thank you, Henry. So I want to look at a couple of cases that have been through the courts just that tell the story. And the first one I want to look at is that of BP. So BP was a resident in a care home. He had Alzheimer's and he was also deaf. And the issue here was about whether or not the restrictions on visits to him was lawful in the context of COVID-19 and his rights to a family life. Now, the local authority accepted that unhesitatingly the restrictions on the home did interfere with his right to a family life because his family couldn't visit as normal. And you will all know that that is the experience of everyone who has people in this situation. But the family submitted that the restrictions on visiting were not specifically subtle to apply and protect the rights of BP, not least because of his added needs due to his deafness. Now, the judge in the case, who was Hayden, who is the vice president of the Court of Protection, considered from a court perspective for the first time the need to have restrictions on visiting, and he found that in these exceptional times that those restrictions on visitings were proportionate. But he also said that when looking at how we apply those restrictions, we need to look at the impact on individuals and assess what's in the best interest of people from their perspective and what they would have wanted in order to try to facilitate and maximise their rights. Thanks, Henry. And this wasn't a case of a care home being at loggerheads with a family. BP's daughter would have preferred her father to stay at the care home. She just wanted more access to him because of his vulnerability. She said if that wasn't possible, she would rather actually he be discharged from the care home and come to live with her. Although she eventually accepted that wasn't possible because she wasn't able to secure a care package. And looking at what her father would have wanted, he would have wanted to impose that burden on her. So given that, and given that he couldn't be discharged, and given that his deafness was also a protected characteristic under the Equalities Act that needed to be given proper attention, the court had to look at, well, what is an effective compromise in his case? And it found that, as we've heard, in terms of the good practice that's around the sector, this needs a reappraisal of how to manage people in these current circumstances. So that required BP's education into the modern world, the digital world of Skype, how to use a communication board and instant messaging. The family were to be given flexibility about going to his room and communicating with him. And it was accepted that all this would take time, effort and creativity, but that was necessary in order to protect his rights to a family life. In a different case, which looked at BP and distinguished it about the need for someone to remain in a care home or to be allowed home, AO was discharged from her hospital to her care home on the 23rd of March. She had terminal cancer. And as a result of the restrictions on non-essential visits, it meant that her daughter, VE, was not able to see her mother at all. So she applied to court because she said that she wanted her mum to come home. And the judge in that case said, well, she should be able to go home because the ability to die with one's family and loved ones is one of the most fundamental parts of the right to a private life. So the right to die well is as important as the right to live well. And family is crucially important when it comes to that. So she was discharged on the 20th of April, the first time her daughter was able to see her again, and died at home 2 days later on the 22nd. It's important to note that each of these cases, as all cases, turn on their facts. And so whilst AO was allowed to go home because she had terminal cancer, a different position would be found probably if the terminal illness of the patient was, say, COVID-19, so a communicable disease, and the risk of that would make it unsafe for someone to go home. Now, going back to BP, the situation changed, and the case came back to court last month. But it changed for a number of reasons. So BP's own situation had deteriorated. He became low in mood, he wasn't eating, he was sleeping more and becoming unresponsive. He'd had an illness, it was thought possibly to be COVID-19, but that was later ruled out. His daughter was visiting, as had been agreed. But BP, crucially, couldn't understand why he could only be visited in that way. He didn't understand the social distancing, and his daughter he felt that he was being punished. And most importantly, between the hearings, BP's daughter had managed to secure a home care package. So, as what happens in many cases, the situation was kept under review, and actually the balance in terms of the rights and the protections and the need for liberty had shifted. And it shows that human rights must also always be considered both as positive and negative obligations. Yes, there's a need to protect life, but that has to be balanced against the risks of that have to be balanced against ensuring liberty, security, and the family life. And in this case, that balance over time had tipped. The review had shown that this was the least restrictive option in his best interests, potentially even if it carried some additional risks. And now just touching on matters which haven't necessarily troubled the courts, but we've seen coming through both in terms of policy and practice that impact on people. With vulnerable people who may lack capacity, then capacity assessments are always crucial, and the need for experts to carry out capacity assessments has been hindered by the inability to visit, but has been changed by the embracing of technology. And we've seen this technology embraced in all spheres. We're here today speaking via this facility. And capacity assessments have been deemed to be perfectly acceptable to be carried out virtually. But it does mean that there is an increased role for staff to make sure that those are facilitated, and so that anyone assessing capacity is able to do that. So staff who know patients and who can help with those are crucially important. Debate about deprivation of liberty in care homes and whether the need for that has increased as a matter of COVID, and a debate about, well, what is the correct way to restrict the liberty of people who have illness as a result of COVID-19. The balance between healthcare legislation and public health legislation, and really the shift of the burden on managing this onto the health protection teams and public health officers. Difficulty with that, as we've heard already, is that there is in some areas a non-existence of public health officers who can help, who can intervene, who can make sure that people are isolated correctly and lawfully. And it's the care providers who have to kind of step into the balance and take the risk that someone will criticise them against the need to protect residents, both those who are infected and those who are at risk of infection. And finally, one thing that is floating around there, a criticism of local authorities who the courts have said, we can't forget that in and amongst all this, there needs to be some business as usual. People who are vulnerable, who lack capacity, need to be able to challenge their deprivation of liberty, and we can't lose sight of that. And so those challenges that used to come through the courts have dropped off dramatically, and that shouldn't be the case, because part of protecting people's rights is to make sure that they continue to have the ability to say where they want to live. So finally, when we look at human rights, we talk about balancing. When we talk about what is necessary and what is proportionate, that constantly has to be kept under review. And as we move forward, hopefully out of this phase of the pandemic, we see the risk of infection decreasing. But what does that mean in terms of freeing up people's rights? If we have track and trace that will help to limit the spread of infection, we have the easing of lockdown. And with the easing of lockdown, the ability for people to get together more, how do we make sure that things like visiting policies, social distances, work in the interest of residents and people receiving care? How do you balance that against the capabilities of your staff to be able to facilitate greater expectation on visits so that they can do that safely? Policies that have been developed to deal with the crisis need to be revisited as we come out of this phase of lockdown. Plans that ought to be made respecting the rights of individuals need to be looked at again. How can we make sure that the care that we provide to people is constantly evolving, so that as we move out of lockdown phase, as we move out of the need to restrict, that is reflected in practice and in policy. The ongoing need to communicate with residents, with their relatives about what's going on, about how you're managing this with your regulators, all crucial, both in terms of on-the-ground management, but also making sure you've got your evidence base to show how compliant you've been with your requirements. And how then do you fit that all in to preparation for a second wave? Whilst we ease the lockdown and ease the restrictions, how do we make sure that when it comes to a second wave, if there is one, we ensure that people's rights, the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to a family life is enshrined as much as possible going forwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Stuart. And I think, you know, my takeaway from that is that clearly the courts and the local authorities cannot agree about these things. So it's a real challenge for providers to have to interpret it in real time in a very fast-moving environment. And I think that really sort of pulls together quite nicely, actually, some of the themes that we've had from the different speakers. I've just put the poll up in terms of health and care strategy coordination, but coming back to what Jeremy was talking about at the beginning, simplification, alignment, proactivity, trusting an open sharing environment of data. I think, you know, we've clearly seen here that there are some things which we all agree on need to be fixed in terms of making that regulation better, in terms of protecting the rights of individuals. The question is how we do that in the next 3 months. So look, I'm just going to switch to the Q&A very briefly, because I'm conscious we're out of time. And I think, you know, part of this is really around you know, how we do fix it in the near term. And we've seen that David Pearson has been announced as the head of the Social Care Task Force. I think he has a mandate to do something in the immediate future as well as in the longer term. And maybe what I'll do is I'll just ask Chris, from his perspective as CQC, what your input is likely to be into this Social Care Task Force, and maybe some of the messages that you've got from us today, whether they will be fed in on behalf of the regulator as well.
I'll just do 4 things. I'm very conscious of the time. Really, really interesting conversation and debate. Just to, because I ticked the next one down, which is about how CQC are going to be supported in post-COVID. So I think there's 4 things, and it will feed into the conversation with David. We talked about trust today, and I know that's trust of us. And I know that sometimes when we are engaged with you, engaged with providers, we're seen as somebody that's coming to, you know, inspect. We're going to criticise. I think there's something about what we talked about when we talk about in the new strategy is we need to cross a threshold more without the act of an inspection. So, because I think the part about trust is building a relationship with people. I think what we've learned through the ESF work that we've done is this is about building an ongoing relationship where we can share and understand what is going on, because this is not about just individual locations, even though that's what the law says. It's actually about how local systems work. So developing some trust. From our perspective, and Vic mentioned it, one of the things I've learned is we need to develop real-time information. The act of regulation and the information we collect was always designed for regulation. It wasn't designed to share generally. And I think the ability for us to learn how to get real-time information out there to support that understanding, it isn't individually targeted at organisations, but perhaps gives providers a sense of what we know about an area or what we know about a local system is more important than ever. And the point about linking trust is learning. So we shouldn't be an organisation that is, and we should be interested in learning. So I think there's the Civilization Authority do a thing about everything beyond reckless. So there's recklessness if you're going to crash a plane, and then everything beyond reckless is about learning. So I think there's a really important point from our perspective about what is reckless behaviour, and there's a small, very, very small cohort of reckless behaviour, but there's lots of this. Our focus should not be in the way we write inspection reports and the way we talk about this. Shouldn't be about what went wrong. It's has there been learning? Because what people who use services want to know is it going to get better? And I think that's so we should promote that learning and understanding. And the last point, going back to the system issue, this is not just about individual organisations. What COVID has taught us is about how systems work together. And I think we've got to press that point home to government, and that sort of goes back to the point about David Pearson. That is the point we'll be pressing home to him. This is not about, what we shouldn't do is say, let's make sure that the NHS sorts itself out, and by the way, let's make sure social care sorts. It shouldn't be like an either or. This is both together. It doesn't work if you have the separation of health and care. And what we'll do in the COVID reviews is try to give a sense of where we think the systems are well aligned and where we think there are problems. And that is some of this is systemic and requires government intervention. But that will be our conversation with David when we begin that conversation with him. Hope that helps, Henry.
It does indeed, and thank you very much for that. I think we are really very much out of time, unfortunately, and I think what this has shown is that this is a hugely challenging and difficult topic. So I think unfortunately I have to wrap up at this point and to say thank you very much to Bevan Britton for supporting us, to our charities Turn to Us and the Care Workers Charity. We've got a whole slew of questions. I will share those with the speakers. And I don't know if there are any sort of last minute comments from the panel, but I fear we have been timed out on this one, and perhaps we need a follow-up panel session just to sort of delve into some of these topics in more detail. But I think on that, thank you very much indeed, everybody. Our next webinar is actually on a totally different project of medical travel with Keith Pollard, and that will be on the 8th of July. So thank you very much for attending, and this will be available on demand on langbuisonevents.com if any of you'd like to see it along with the slides.